Welcome to the MVM review of Blackout Hong Kong. This one is from Alexander Pfister and Eggertspiel. It came out at Essen 2018. This is a 1 to 4 player deck building, hand management, engine building for sure game with a really unique theme.
Yeah, so the idea is that Hong Kong, or the city of Hong Kong, has gone through a blackout, and you are one of the leaders who is sending your volunteers and your specialists into the city to basically secure it because all kinds of havoc is running loose. So the game is going to be played out over an X number of rounds depending upon the number of players at the table, and that's dictated by the cards that you see over here. There's a giant stack of cards, and these are going to form 3 rows in which people are going to be collecting those cards, adding them to their player boards, and then eventually fulfilling the objectives on the cards themselves and adding them to their deck. When that runs out, that's going to signify the end of the game.
Yeah, a lot of the cards that you're going to be pulling into your hand eventually have kind of this staging area, which is your board. They serve as both objectives and eventually the volunteers and potentially specialists that you get in your hand. There are, in fact, actually objective cards that you can get as well, which do something slightly different.
When you look at the player board, this is going to house all the different actions within the game, starting from 1 going all the way to 8. So players can, at any time, look where the round progress is at any given time. The board's going to house, as David said, all your different objectives across here, and then it's going to have 3 or possibly 4 slots, depending upon whether or not you unlock this slot. These are where your specialists and your volunteers are going to be in columns that are going to give you very specific resources. Now, the trick in this game is when you play these cards from your hand, you're not going to get them back until you do a very specific refresh. So the more cards you use and where you put them in the slots is going to determine the resources and which ones you can get back later on in the game.
Yeah, it's interesting because these cards in your hand are not, like Jeremy said, something you can play turn after turn after turn. You want to be very careful and considerate about when you're playing cards because it might take a while to get those things back.
Also, on the left-hand side of your player board, you're going to have 5 district secure markers. These are going to be placed on the board when you secure specific areas within Hong Kong. These are going to give you very subtle bonuses when you take a refresh action. Also, on the right-hand side of the board, this is your hospital. At the end of the game, anything or any cards that are in your hospital, you're going to score 0 victory points for, but you do have a doctor who's going to be able to bring those back into your hand through the course of the game.
Yeah, and in addition to your player boards and the cards, of course, there is the main board. And the main board is going to be broken up into a couple different regions with a lot of things going on. The first region is the city of Hong Kong. You've got this with all of these nodes that you're going to be traveling around, placing pieces out on, and then these scout tokens as well that you're going to be searching through as your teams go out there to find resources, to find things in order to sort of secure the city again. And then over on the right-hand side is going to be the core mechanic of the game. It's not really a rondel of sorts, but it's this pie-shaped chart that has the various resources that you're going to be using to fulfill objectives and do various things in the game, and the resource dice, which are going to be rolled at the beginning of every round to determine what resources are sort of naturally available as you play your cards.
Yeah, resources are marked in the game by player cubes, so when you gather a specific type of resource, you're simply going to place it in that particular area on the map. You also have coins. This is used to buy more objective cards, which turn into your volunteers and your specialists through the course of the game. Each player is going to start with 5 of these transport markers. These transport markers allow you to move a little more easily across the map of Hong Kong, but they also allow you to mess with this pie chart that you mentioned over here by securing resources that aren't typically rolled with the dice in the game.
Yeah, the transport tokens are going to give you a little bit of flexibility to sort of bend the rules from time to time in the game. And then finally, we have these GPS tokens. These are going to be acquired a couple different ways throughout the game, and they're going to help you when you go out and do those scouting actions to sort of uncover what's out here on the map.
All right, to best understand the game and what we're trying to accomplish, you guys need to understand the cards themselves. Everyone's going to start with 12 cards. They're all the same cards for all of the players. 2 of the cards are going to be placed in the hospital. That is your high-level volunteer and then your leader. Again, these aren't available until you use a doctor to get those back in your hands. However, the other 10 cards are available. Now this, as we said, is a deck-building sort of game. You're going to be adding cards into your hand through the course of the game, but it's never really a deck because you always have the cards in your hand available to you to look through at any given time, so you can plot out which cards you want to use at any given time. There's going to be 2 basic types. You have your volunteer volunteers, and then you have your specialists. Your volunteers are going to have cubes across the top. Those are going to signify or relate specifically to the dice that you see on the actual pie chart of the rondel. So this ties into the yellow die, where I may have a red one that ties specifically into the red die. Those are going to give you resources for the die that is rolled. However, your specialists work a little bit differently. These all have special powers. When you use these or reveal them during a very specific part of the game, they're going to give you some kind of ability. And everyone's going to start with 4 unique ones. Of course, one of them is their leader, which is off in the hospital to start the game. So to play the game, it's very, very simple. We'll talk through some of the steps. We're not going to get too down into the weeds because there's a lot of stuff going on. But the very first thing that happens on a turn is that one of the players is going to roll all 3 of these dice. And they're going to slot them into the areas that are revealed on the die themselves. If any of the 2 dice match, you have to re-roll them until you have 3 very unique resources. Then each player is going to look at their hand, and they're going to plan which cards they wish to use. The cards they wish to use, there's a couple things that have to happen. Number 1, you're going to take one of those cards and put them into one of the 3 available slots at the start of the game. Some of these are going to be filled at the very beginning, so some of these are going to already have pre-existing cards in them. When you place them, they're face down, and only one card can be in each of the individual slots when you place them face down.
Yeah, and once everyone's done that, you're going to reveal your cards and collect resources or do the actions on the specialist cards that you may have played. Now, this is where it's interesting, and this is where the massive amount of decision-making begins, because there's a lot of things you want to consider as you're laying these cards. For instance, if you look here, if you're really wanting food because you're working on an objective that needs food, you might play a card that has 2 red cubes or 2 different cards that have red cubes at the top, because that's going to allow you to collect more food this round. However, you also want to consider the columns that you're building here, because there's a number of objectives and a number of different things in the game that trigger off the color combinations of cards that you've played in these columns. It's really quite a few puzzles that you're balancing as you play these cards.
Now you may ask yourself at this point, am I subjective to the cards that I place? No. When you have cards that have a very particular resource on them, such as the yellow, you don't typically have to take the resource that you have. And in order to do that, you can use one of these transport tokens to move clockwise or counterclockwise around that board to take different resources. So like any good Euro game, there's flexibility on being able to use these cards. You don't have to do it, but you do have to have the resources to use those. All right, so once that is done, each of the players in turn order is going to try to complete any of the objectives on their player board. Now, these are the cards that you've grabbed from previous rounds. You're going to start with some starter objectives, but these objectives are basically future cards that you can have within the game. When you look at all the other cards that aren't starting cards, they're going to have a combination of resources that you need across the bottom. These are the objectives you're trying to complete by using the resources on that rondel. When you complete these are actually going to go into your hand, and that's the deck building portion of the game. You want to complete these because they're going to give you victory points, they're going to give you more flexibility in the resources that you collect, and they're going to be more and better specialists that allow you to do very unique things within the game.
Yeah, and that really takes us right into the second stage, is when you're completing these objectives. Like Jeremy said, you take these cards in your hand, and in many cases, almost all of these cards are going to allow you also to then interact with the map on the board, because each of them are going to be color-coded to some of these nodes that are all over the board, at which point you can take one of your cubes and put it on that colored node. Now, there's some rules you have to follow, of course. It has to be adjacent to one of your colored cubes. However, you can use one of those transport tokens that we mentioned for the rondel here as well, and move a little further, landing still on the colored node that you need to land on, but you can get some flexibility there as well.
And those objectives that you're trying to complete are not only volunteers and specialists, but there's also special cards in there as well, such as emergency plans and just straight out objectives that are going to give you ongoing benefits through the course of the game. Once that's done, each player in turn order then is going to be able to scout, and you're going to look at the map and where you have your color around the map. You can then do a search on those particular nodes that are adjacent to it. So if I am the orange player, I can search this location, this location, this location, or this location. And by doing so, you're going to pick up all 3 of the scout tokens in this area and look at them in secret. Each of these scout tokens has a number of different objectives that you're trying to complete on them, but at the top of each scout token and at the bottom it's going to have a number with the number of search tokens that you have to have available. The search tokens are the cards that you still have in your hand at any given time, because these cards, not only do they have something across the top for your specialists, something across the bottom for your volunteers, but also each of them can contribute searches to this portion of the game. Now, this is when you're trying to match numbers. So if I have 4 cards with 1 search each, and I have a scout token that requires 4, I just have to show that to one of the players at the table. Then I'm going to have to lose one of those cards randomly. So I'm going to give those 4 cards to my opponent. He's going to pick one of them and then put that character into my hospital. This is how you're going to be able to scout. And scouting is really cool because it's going to give you points, it's going to give you resources, but also it's going to give you something at the end of the game as well.
Yeah, a lot of these tokens that you're going to be collecting have various icons, usually associated with what you're immediately getting, but they're also associated with a bit of a set collection thing. I think there's 7 different types that you can collect, and with the wider variety that you have at the end, you're going to get points as you collect them.
Once that portion of the game is over, you're then allowed to buy new objectives. You have to have room on your objectives board in order to place them. So you only have room for 3 of them. If it's already full, you have to skip out of this portion of the game. Now, players are allowed to buy objectives in turn order. When you do so, you're allowed to buy from any one of these 3 rows. Now, the cost of these is equal to the amount of cards in there. So if there are 3 cards in there, it's going to cost you 4. If there are 2 cards, it's going to cost you 3. And if there's only 1 card, it's going to cost you 2. And this is very unique too, because you can pass and still be in the round if it comes back to you. You're only out of the round if all 4 players in a 4-player game pass in turn order. And as that deck starts to deplete, or that row starts to deplete, the cost of buying the cards that are left becomes less and less. And it's only refilled when a column is, or a row is completely depleted.
Yeah, there are definitely some mind games that start going on here, because like Jeremy said, when you're looking at the cost, if you're the first one to pick, you're looking at 3 rows of 3 cards potentially at the beginning of the game. That's a lot of money to spend. So maybe I'll wait. Then it comes around to me, I might pay less, but those cards that I really wanted might be gone at that point.
The next couple phases are basically your last phases of the game. You have the cleanup. Any of the resources that are perishable, being your water and your food, are going to convert into money or GPS tokens. Then you're going to secure districts. So one of the ideas in the game is you want to build your cubes around on these nodes around one particular scouting area. When you do so, you unlock a player power for the rest of the game during the refresh, which is the final phase of the game. The refresh is when you're going to look at your hand of cards that you have left after doing all those different steps. And if you have 0 through 4 cards, you're allowed to do a refresh. A couple things happen here. The first thing is you have to take your at the bottom of your player board, you're going to have bunches of columns down here with cards that you've been placing through the course of the game. You have to take the stack of cards with the most cards in it back into your hand. The next thing that happens is if you do a refresh, meaning that you have 0 through 4 cards in your hand, then you're allowed to activate any of these tokens or any of these things you have over here, or any of the cards that you've previously accumulated through the course of the game, and do their refresh action as well.
Yeah, and when Jeremy says it allows you to refresh, sometimes you'll look at it that way, and sometimes you'll look at it as it forces you to refresh, because you don't necessarily want to do that. Again, you really have to balance a lot of things as you play these cards out here, because there's so many different things you can do, and you want those cards out there at times, and then other times you want those cards back in your hand.
The thing that triggers the end of the game is when you cannot refill one of these rows again. That's going to mark the end of the game. Victory points are going to be scored for a variety of different things. All of your resources are going to convert into money. Money's going to convert into victory points. And then any of the cards that you have left in your hand, any of the cards that are below your player board, each of those are going to have a very specific number of victory points that it contributes. You're going to add those as well. Anything in your hospital or any of the objectives that you have not completed are not added. And the final thing that's going to score are your scout tokens. You're trying to get unique different types of scout tokens through the course of the game. And those are going to be scored depending upon the more variety of those that you have.
Now, keep in mind, this is not the only scoring that happens in the game.
Absolutely not.
There is plenty of scoring that happens throughout the game. When you're securing districts, you're going to score those. And what's interesting is these nodes don't hold just one cube. Multiple players can have their cubes on these nodes, so when a district scores, if I'm the one that secured it, I'm going to score the most points, but if other people had cubes on there, they're going to get some points too, riding on the shirt tails of whoever completed it.
All right, so that's a lot of information, and hopefully you guys breezed through that and got to right to this point, because we're going to talk about how we feel about the game. That's probably the most important thing for you guys as a viewer. So let's talk about our positives first.
Yeah.
I love Alexander Pfister. He's one of my favorite designers. Of course, he did Mombasa and Great Western Trail. I love Great Western Trail. This has a lot of those core mechanics from both of those games built into it. And I feel like it's a little simpler, but it's also a lot more approachable. And I say that having played both of those games in the past. If you haven't played either one of those, there's a lot of stuff going on in this game. So there's a slight learning curve, but it's not unapproachable by any means.
No, it's not unapproachable. We've referenced this player board a number of times. It walks you through the steps. So once someone's taught you how to play, you can walk through those steps very carefully. And in fact, I'd almost recommend mock walking through those steps a little bit, just kind of giving people an idea of the progress of the game. Because the real significant part of how you're going to use your brain in this thing, like we've referenced already, is the decisions you're going to be making playing these cards, because there's a number of different variables that you have to consider. And this is sort of a double-edged sword. We really like that because it really is sort of a crunchy game. But like we said, if it's your first time playing, it's going to take some getting used to that. It's not inaccessible as a game in your first time, but you'll definitely play better on your second time, and you'll definitely play even better on your third time.
Yeah, taking that even further, this is a pure game of optimization. Each turn you're trying to decide what you want to do at that particular point of the game. And there's a lot of pre-planning in this game as well. You may want to spend a whole round just putting a lot of resources on that wheel, knowing that you're not going to complete any of your objectives. You're not going to buy any new objectives. You're probably not going to scout that round. Pre-planning for the future. I love that part of the game. There's a very strong pre-planning, but there's also a very strong engine building portion of the game too. The objectives that you pull into your, or the cards that you pull into your objective board, the timing of when you complete those and when you can expand on the map, how soon you want to unlock these, because there's points in the game where you may not unlock any of them. And there's points where you may rush to unlock a very small bonus, but it may trickle through the course of the game. That's another thing. I love the bonuses off to the left-hand side. Several of the people that I played through have said on many occasions that they're just not powerful enough. And I like that portion of the game. I like that they're not powerful. I like that they just slightly enhance your engine through the course of the game. Because if they were too powerful, everybody would do them.
Yeah, true. There's a lot of different routes to go here. One of the things that's going to trigger it, along with those bonuses, are a lot of the objective cards that you'll get will have that same green check mark that you can trigger as well. Now, it must be said, those are a little bit more powerful than the ones that are innate in everyone's board. So you could really build an engine and work that way and hopefully try to refresh a number of times. And then there's, alternatively, you can go a different way and not do so much of that and really try to trigger off those big, tall columns that you're building down below your board.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to approach victory points in this game, and I absolutely love that. Do you have any other pros before we get into the cons?
Yeah, I would say one major pro for me, and as with any Euro game, we always love flexibility and ways to mitigate whatever luck might appear to be in the game. And obviously, at the beginning of each round, you're rolling these dice. And like we said, you're not going to be stuck with just what those dice are. You have maximum flexibility. We mentioned these 5 transport tokens you start with. What we didn't mention is that any time in the game, you can effectively spend one of your victory points for a transport token. This is an ongoing free action. You don't have to do it during any step. So at any point, if you're wanting to mitigate something like that, you can basically just give up a victory point to do so. We played another game earlier this year, completely different, called Silk, which gave you that same flexibility because you're rolling dice. The game revolves around the dice. But in this one, you can do whatever you want, really, for the most part. But you're going to be sacrificing a lot of victory points to do so.
And not only that, but you can also spend $5 at any time in the game to get a battery. And a battery is a wild resource. So that's something else that you can do. All right, negatives. Do you have any negatives to talk about?
Like I said earlier, double-edged sword here. Some people are going to like the crunchiness. Some people are going to get a headache playing the game. Because, especially if you're playing with someone who has some experience. Because you're going to be doing it, they're going to have some experience under their belt. They'll know what's going on. You're figuring this thing out for the first time. And when you look, everything in this game, when you look at, there's you think you're looking at it for the right reason, but you might not be looking at it for the right reason. For instance, these cards over here, you look at these things and you see these powers, right? And the powers are what first draw you like, oh, I want that card because it does X, Y, or Z. But in many respects, you want a lot of these cards for a timing aspect because you might want to synergize the objectives you're working off of so that you can execute a lot of those objectives at once. So if they have similar things that you're looking to fulfill, particularly with the cards below your board, because you can apply those to multiple objectives when you're fulfilling them. You can really get a lot done, and the action of the card is sort of secondary in many respects.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about in this game. Almost everything in the game interacts off of something else. So if you're good at planning those things and min-maxing your resources, because this isn't a game about just piling on resources, because you're not going to be able to do that, number one.
No.
But number two, you have to spend the exact amount of resources to complete those objectives to pull other engines within the game. So if you're good at that type of game, you're going to like this. If you're not, I would steer clear of it. Okay, two things that I don't really like about the game. Number one is probably the most obvious. It's ugly, and I'll just say that. I don't like the graphic design. I don't like the art in the game. I think that some of this, this just is not appealing to me. The gameplay is awesome. The art, I think they could have gone in a far different direction.
I would say, interestingly enough, I felt the same way when I first looked at this thing. The art and the graphic design has actually grown on me after the couple plays. What I would say along with that, though, is the quality, or maybe the use of black on everything, because it flecks off a lot of these components. Some of the cards, we've sleeved this whole thing, but even some of the tokens, you'll see around the edges, once that gets a little dinged, there's going to be one token on the board that has that one white fleck, and there's a lot of hidden information here. I might be able to look at this over the course of many plays and go, oh, that's that one that requires 16, while no one else knows that at the table. So those have some issues, even some creasing on the board because it's so black. Opening and closing this board is going to create some crease lines, some visible crease lines that you wouldn't otherwise get in a lot of games.
Yes, that's number one. The second thing is this game has very little to no interaction. It's basically a solo game. The only blocking you're going to do in this game is taking a card that someone else may want to grab at some particular time. That's because every single one of these locations or nodes on the board can be occupied by multiple people. So there's not really a race in order to control things or to build routes and block other people off. There's just a race to also occupy those areas so that when they are secured, you get victory points that just like other players were. So the players are gamers that like more interaction in their games. You're not going to find this. This is purely a solo experience for the most part.
Yeah, that is not a con for me. I think that does fall into that category like you're alluding to, as it's going to be a pro for some people, it's going to be a con for other people. I actually kind of like that whole concept of not being able to get blocked on here and actually being able to ride the shirt tails of other people's progress. It's kind of fun when someone else, even though you might have been trying to secure the same area, they secure it, but you have 3 cubes on there, so you're scoring 3 points out of it as well. It feels like you didn't put forth a lot of effort that just went for nothing.
All right. Having said those negatives, I still absolutely love the game. I've played it half a dozen times now. Love the designer, love the different things you're doing. I love all the pre-planning in the game and all the little engines that you can build. And I think that I've played the game 6 different times every time that I've played it, or approached a strategy differently every single time.
Yeah, and it works at many different player counts, in fact. I would probably prefer 2 to 3. I do think at 4 players, at least for my own taste, the game can get a little long. I think the box says up to 150 minutes.
Probably right.
That's a long game for people. That's probably right, or on the short side, because it can go long with all of that AP. If someone's susceptible to AP, I will tell you, they could be sitting here for a while with their brain melting before your eyes, because this game has a lot to consider.
So that is Blackout Hong Kong. It's from Eggertspiel, 1 to 4 players. It also has a campaign if you guys are interested. You can play this over multiple different play sessions. If you guys have any questions about the game, make it in the comments below. Subscribe to us, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and everything else that we do, and we will catch you guys next time.
Bye-bye.